Unperson, a Generation Loss AU and story, written, illustrated, and narrated by Molish. Chapter 2, Devourer's Debut. Do you know what it is like, being alone at the edge of the universe, having already come to terms with your mortality, ready to embrace the end, to accept the fall into the yawning grave with open arms, a dreamless sleep at last, only to be pulled back into the glare of the world by cruel and callous hands, to be put back together through the act of being torn apart. Self-sublation, self-obfuscation, your metamorphosis, lusus naturae. They gilded all that had made you shatter in the first place, and reveled in what was broken. Corrupted kintsugi, koyaniskatsi. "Arise, ghost of Banquo! You have a Thane of Cawdor to haunt," commanded Hetch with his characteristic theatrical lilt. The sound of the director's voice was the spark that reignited the flame of Rambo's consciousness. The darkness that had shrouded his mind in sweet nihility was wrenched away. He was completely incapacitated, numb to everything, unable to lift a finger. How am I... Where is... I'm still... With unmasked delight, Hetch continued. Your prior finale really left quite the impact on you, as it did the audience. Exactly as expected, they howled for an encore. An image of a blood-red room flashed before his mind's eye, a camera staring at him hungrily, a live wire pricking the back of his throat, jaws of iron devouring the light as they closed upon him, teeth of metal piercing his skin, his mouth, his cheek, his temples, his retina, his skull, blood running down his neck, down his spine, down his trembling fingers, white-hot agony boring into his soul, crushing it, eviscerating it, unraveling his life and his future, and burning the threads to ash before the darkness consumed him. Oblivion had lingered, enveloping him whole, shielding him from the glare of the world with a protective embrace. "Open your eyes, Rambo." No, I don't want to see. I said, open your eyes. No, please, I don't want to see. I can't go back there. A jolt of electricity shot through Rambo's nervous system, and his eyes flew open. The solace of the fog of oblivion was gradually torn away from his left eye as he blinked, but the right was still shrouded in a lightless haven. We were unable to salvage that one, I'm afraid, or the original at least. But don't you fret. I'll just give your substitute a little more juice, and it should function just fine. Rambo blinked again as his gaze began to focus. Slowly, his depth perception improved as the haze was lifted from his right eye, and he began to see with some clarity. He was terrified of the light. Rambo yearned for a return to the comforting embrace of the dark, but he was afraid that closing his eyelids to shut out the world for more than an instant would trigger another painful shock. Gradually, his mind began to process the information his retinas were feeding it. He was looking upwards at a cold white ceiling. Two large and circular lights, like the kind one would find in a medical examination room, flanked a CCTV camera that was anchored directly above him. The sight of the lens, coupled with the brightness of the room, filled him with anxiety, but Rambo's body was still incapable of physically responding to the fearful stimuli. He still couldn't feel anything, and hadn't yet mustered the energy to even attempt to move. Optics are all operating as expected, as are your auditory functions, considering that you've been responding to my words. Right, then, let's activate your olfactory processors. Rambo's heartbeat grew faster, and his eyes widened as he suddenly became aware of the sharp and metallic stench of blood. Not again. Not again. Make it stop! The director sounded like he was pleased by Rambo's adverse reaction. Brilliant! Now let's jumpstart your peripheral basic motor functions. Give those fingers a wiggle for me. Another brief electric shock coursed through him. The pain was intense, but passed quickly. It helped to clear a little more of the fog from his mind. His sense of touch began to spread from the base of his neck through his chest and out to his limbs, although the lower half of his face still remained completely numb. Rambo's breathing quickened upon realizing that he was lying supine on some kind of surgical table, with his arms splayed out to either side. Both were fastened to the table with restraints, as were his legs, torso, and neck, and he could feel something digging into his spine that wasn't just the uncomfortable table surface. can't be here. Not again. I can't do this again. He turned his head to the side to better gauge his situation, but his blood ran cold upon seeing that both of his forearms were gone. In their place were the antebrachia of a mechanical beast. Between thick metal rods that served as elongated ulnar and radial bones, weaved an intricate network of cables and wires of varying colors and sizes. The wires threaded into the remaining tissue of Rambo's upper arms, forging an unnatural, bloodied union between his human flesh and an array of mechanized nerves interlocking with the dense animalistic musculature that constituted his reconstructed limbs. Large bestial hands that sprouted from each appendage were fashioned entirely out of metal, and each fingertip tapered into a disproportionately long and incredibly sharp point, like the blade of a scythe or the massive claw of some prehistoric predator. What did they do to me? Why is this happening to me? Rambo instinctively tried to wrench his arms free of their bonds, but the restraints were tightly and securely fastened. He flexed the claws on each hand in an attempt to get a better grip on the table or to slice off the bindings, but they wouldn't budge. Get me out of here! Let me go! Fantastic! Hetch applauded over the speaker. It appears that the nervous connections to your brachial replacements are responsive. Legs, please. The neck restraint made it difficult to move his head, but Rambo did his best to peer down towards his feet. To his alarm, the lower half of his legs had received the same treatment as his forelimbs. From the calves downwards, interlocking cable, wire, and metal replaced what had once been mangled tendon, flesh, and bone. Digitigrade musculature and mechanical joints, raised at the heel, tapered into large extremities tipped with sharp digits. Rambo shifted his foot, and the sound of mechanical claws grating on the metal surface of the table made him shudder. What have they done to me? Upgraded appendages optimized for speed, ferocity, and lethality. I would be thrilled to have the opportunity to test out such enhancements. Hetch almost sounded genuinely jealous. It looks like everything is so far running as it should. Only one more box to take before we continue. From the wall just beyond the surgical table, a high-pitched whir sounded as a white robotic arm extended from it and held a flat, square-shaped object above Rambo's head. He flinched. You're never fully dressed without a smile, Rambo! The director's voice exclaimed in a light-hearted tone, like he was encouraging a young actor about to step onto the stage for the first time. The object flipped itself over to reveal the perfectly polished surface of a mirror. Rambo's face stared back at him. It was wrong. One of the eyes, his left, or the mirror's right, was familiar. It was heavily hooded with a blue-gray iris, sunken slightly from exhaustion, and shadowed by an angular brow that was creased with anguish and concern. The other side of his face was slightly covered by a lock of thick, dirty blonde hair which he had shaken loose in his agitation, but it failed to conceal the heavy scarring which marred the bloodied and bruised skin that surrounded the corresponding eye socket. The right eye itself looked normal enough upon first glance, but as Rambo shifted his gaze, crimson light reflected off of an inhuman layer of tapetum lucidum, just like the pupil of an owl shines in the light of a torch. An array of small, yet expertly made stitches weaved in and out of the planes of his face like a masterwork Frankensteinian quilt. The lower half of his face was still shrouded by smoky-hued metal. Although now slightly larger in size, the design of the mask was nearly identical to that which he had worn when I died. The two pairs of parallel lights defining the side planes of the mask remained, although none of them were presently lit. Rambo noticed that the skin that was visible around the upper edges of the mask was pulled taut and stained heavily with dried blood. More stitches peeked out of the corners, disappearing behind the wiring that protruded from the sides and wrapped around the back of his head. He wanted to squeeze his eyes shut, to stop seeing, to stop thinking, but Rambo could not wrench his gaze away from the mask that was his own face. "Come now, don't be shy," Hetch's voice jeered. "Show us those pearly whites!" The red lights flickered on, and along with the glow came sensation. The numbness he felt drained away, replaced almost instantly by an agonizing burn that ran from his cheeks all the way down to his thyroid. Rambo tried to scream, and the mask opened. With a harsh mechanical screech, the metal plates grouped together into 6 separate segments, which split apart from the center, 3 to each side. The largest pair, housing the lights, wrenched open laterally. The panels beneath them angled downwards like an insect's mandibles. At the top, the smallest segment stood poised upwards and outwards like a raptor's beak that had been cleaved in two. He had no tongue to scream with. In place of Rambo's nose and chin was a gaping maw rimmed with metal. Rows upon rows of yellowed teeth, wickedly sharp canines and incisors of varying and almost randomized sizes, lined bloodied pink gums on the inside of the segmented mandibles. "There they are! A show-stopping set of gnashers, if I do say so myself," the director chuckled over the speakers. "Adam would be jealous." "This can't be happening. This can't be happening. It hurts. It hurts. Make it stop." "Everything appears to be in order," Hetch said joyfully as the mechanical arm holding the mirror retracted back into the wall. The bindings that strapped Rambo's body to the surgical table were suddenly released, and he felt whatever was digging into his spine retract as well. He flung himself to the floor, and his mechanized limbs clanged loudly upon their impact with the hard, white tiling on the ground. He immediately backed himself into a corner of the room and began clawing at his face, trying in vain to remove the nightmarish mask, but doing so only caused some of the stitches to rip open and bleed freely down his neck. Hetch loudly chided him over the speaker. "Now stop that! Why you would want to damage a work of art like that in the first place, I will never understand. You've been enhanced, elevated, into a thing of beauty." Rambo wasn't listening. He didn't care if ripping off the mask would harm or even kill him. In fact, that's what he wanted. "Get it off! Get it off! I can't do this again! I can't! It hurts! It hurts! I can't become like that abomination! I won't!" He gripped the sides of the mask and tried to pull it off to no avail. Tears of pain, anger, and frustration ran down his cheeks and mixed with the blood that had started seeping from his freshly opened wounds. "You foolish boy! Stop that!" Hetch shouted at him. "You can't remove your own face!" Rambo tried again to scream. The mask opened once more, and a monstrous wail escaped from his throat, intermixed by a chorus of insectoid chittering from the steel mandibles as they vibrated and clacked together. He was just about to try slamming his face directly into the wall when several mechanical arms detached from the ceiling, clamped down onto his arms, and rammed his back into the wall behind him, suspending him a foot above the ground. Rambo kicked and bared his mandibles with a guttural hiss at the CCTV camera. "Hush now!" The hiss was cut short as he felt something stab into his spine directly between his scapulae. The lights on his mask flared brightly, and a quick but immensely painful bolt of electricity shot through the back of Rambo's neck and down his spinal cord. He convulsed briefly before the mask snapped shut, and his head hung limply against his chest. "Now look what you've done!" Hetch exclaimed with irritation. "Note to self, during the subject's final rewiring update, install an automatic disciplinary trigger activated upon the physical undertaking of any self-destructive action. We can't have our Devourer destroying itself, even before the alpha test is complete, now can we?" A compartment opened in the wall to Rambo's side, and another pair of robotic arms came forth, bearing some kind of harness. He watched dimly as whatever had stabbed into his back, presumably a cable of some sort, disconnected itself while the arms in front of him fastened the harness onto his torso. A thin, rectangular metal box bearing the black and white Shofar logo rested in the middle of his chest at an angle. One thick cable on each side passed underneath his arms, and one over his right shoulder and two over his left held the box securely in place. Each of the cables intersected in a similar unit on his back between his shoulder blades, right where he had been plugged in previously. The lights on Rambo's mask flashed again, and he grunted as something underneath the two connecting units pierced him. The robotic arms that had fastened the harness onto him retracted, and those that had him pinned against the wall released him. Rambo collapsed onto the floor in a crumpled heap. "This harness port is a temporary solution while we finish up our tests. Upon your final update, you won't be needing it anymore, as the disciplinary trigger will be installed directly into your cerebellar chip." Rambo neither understood what was being said nor cared. He wanted an end to all of this, a permanent end that he had once been promised and then was so cruelly denied. "Now up you get, Rambo. You've wasted enough time already. On to the second round of alpha testing. We must make sure you are primed in an exemplary condition before we can allow the beta audience to bear witness to the Devourer's debut, after all." Rambo didn't get up, nor did he even raise his head in acknowledgement of Hetch's words. He brought his knees up to his chest and covered his head with his inhuman, blood-stained hands. He remained lying there on the floor, his body curled up into a shivering ball, racked by silent sobbing. Congratulations, patron of the arts. We here at Showfall Interactive Phantoptics are thrilled that you have chosen to participate in the beta testing of Anathema Annihilation. Here, your choices really matter. From a range of familiar faces, you have the opportunity to choose who will serve as the companion and guide for your hero avatar. Once selected, you may pick from a variety of immersive maps to explore, each with their own unique professions, themes, and corresponding environments. Eliminate the anathemas. Vanquish the abominations. Only one player may win the game. Good luck, patron. Choose wisely. From the depths of an Eigengrau sea, Charlie felt the threads of his mind being pulled upwards toward the surface. Little by little, they weaved and rose together out of the inky darkness of oblivion, until at last his mind, intact once more, broke free into the light of consciousness. Charlie's eyes flew open as he sat bolt upright. The momentum of his awakening caused him to fling himself sideways, and he fell with a thud onto hard wooden floorboards below him. With a groan, he righted himself and began rubbing the arm he had just bruised in the fall. Ow. He blinked the fog from his eyes, and, after locating and donning his fallen glasses, took in his surroundings. Where the fuck am I? He was completely alone, sitting in a room constructed of rotting wood and rusted iron nails. It sported no less than 20 crudely fashioned bunk bed pallets, devoid of any actual bedding, and the low ceiling above was supported by crude logs that hadn't even been stripped of their bark. A single dirt-stained window to his left allowed a shaft of cold, overcast grey light to filter into the room, highlighting a thin layer of dust that coated every surface. Opposite the window was a door that lay slightly ajar, likewise made of the same rotting wood haphazardly held together by a few rusted nails. Charlie shivered. Despite not being directly exposed to the elements, the air in the room was bitingly cold. He instinctively wrapped his arms around himself to conserve body heat, and, to his surprise, he noticed that he was already wearing a quilted gambeson jacket. The material was sage green and sported a white patch on the right breast, bearing an oddly familiar embroidered black logo. His dark trousers, made of a similar warm material to that of his jacket, were adorned with a number of pockets, all empty to Charlie's disappointment, and tucked into a pair of well-worn and faded black leather combat boots. He racked his brain for a moment in an effort to remember how he had arrived in this strange place, wearing these strange clothes, but nothing would surface in his memory. Charlie grunted as he slowly picked himself up off the floor and began to massage his aching neck. I guess I'll see what's beyond that door. He approached it slowly and peeked through the gap. Beyond was nothing but an array of dust motes that meandered lazily about a quiet and empty hallway, illuminated only by small streams of light that bled in through various cracks in the deteriorating walls. Pulling his jacket more tightly around himself, Charlie stepped through the doorway. The hall was lined with doors that were all left slightly ajar. Charlie investigated a few of them, but they all led to rooms that were identical to the one he had woken up in, cold, empty, and furnished with nothing but empty pallets of rotten wood and rusted iron. Giving up on investigating these rooms, Charlie instead made his way to the door at the end of the hallway, and, just as a precaution, he put his ear up to its decaying surface to listen for any signs of life or movement. Nothing. He gave it a gentle push, and the door creaked inwards to reveal a supply room? It was just as dusty as the rest of the obscure and obviously abandoned building, but this room, for a change, was not completely empty. In fact, it was far from it. Along the walls protruded several crudely constructed shelves and hooks, and a meager collection of old boxes and crates lay undisturbed in one of the corners. Upon the shelves were stacked a number of jackets and trousers, like his own, along with several belts, an odd pair of boots, and a few stray pairs of gloves, and a pile of steel plates. Charlie picked up one of the belts, which was equipped with an empty knife sheath, as well as a couple of barren pouches and an empty holster, and wrapped it around his waist. He inspected the pile of steel plates next, and upon lifting one of them up, discovered that the plates were actually joined together by rivets and small pieces of leather to form some kind of segmented cuirass. SN-38 old Soviet body armor. Useless piece of crap, really. Wait, how the fuck did I know that? Charlie shook his head, as if doing so would miraculously make an explanation clear to him. Whatever. Might as well use it, I guess. Couldn't hurt. He lifted the steel plates over his head and wriggled the cuirass into place over his gambeson. After fastening the pieces together and readjusting his belt over it, he was surprised to find that the old piece of body armor actually fit his form quite well. Next, he plucked 2 of the gloves from another shelf and slipped them onto his hands, which had begun to shake in the cold. A bit big, but they'll do. At least my fingers won't fall off from frostbite now. Following that, Charlie turned his attention towards one of the crates in the corner. It took little effort and a lot of irritated grumbling, but he eventually managed to pry it open. The struggle was worth it. Stashed inside of the crate was a collection of rusted old NR-40 combat knives. Tetanus schmetnus. At least the gloves should count for some protection. Here goes nothing. He began to rummage around the crate in search of a blade that wasn't rusted to the point of being completely useless, and gave a satisfied chuckle when he finally found one. He carefully slid it into the sheath on his belt, and was again pleasantly surprised to find that it fit rather perfectly. Not sure what all this is doing just laying about here, but clearly no one's coming to collect it if the dust and rust are anything to go by. It's all mine now, suckers! Charlie spent a few more minutes rifling through the other boxes and crates, but most were either empty or had contents that were far too damaged to be of any use. Once he was satisfied that he had equipped himself with all that he could, he tried the knob on the opposite door. It stubbornly refused to turn at first, but after giving it a final hefty twist, Charlie wrenched it open. He found himself in a room lined wall-to-wall with old filing cabinets that left only just enough space so as not to block his view of the exit door, and a small window, although the latter was far too dirty to actually see through. Charlie wrested one of the rusted drawers open, and took out a file, causing a few old sheets of paper to fall to the ground. Upon picking them up, he turned so that the dim light that filtered through the filthy window cast a little illumination on the pages in his hand. The heading of the first page caught his eye. Prisoner records. Wait, since when the fuck did I know how to read Russian? Charlie put the thought aside for a second while he skimmed through the documents. Some had lines that were scribbled out, some were too stained or faded with age to read clearly, but others that were more intact remained legible. They contained a list of names, mostly Russian, some German, Ukrainian, and Belarusian among others, conviction statuses, an inventory of property, and a short description of each person's identity, the latest entry of which was apparently recorded in 1951. Is this an abandoned prison or something? Why leave these records here? He gingerly placed the documents back into the drawer and pushed it shut. Whatever, I'm getting the hell out of here. Before he could make his way through the sea of filing cabinets to the exit, Charlie nearly jumped out of his skin upon hearing something scuttle across the floor just in front of him. He yelped and knocked into one of the cabinets and drew his knife from its sheath in preparation to defend himself. A small lemming stared at him from the floor with beady black eyes, grabbed a tattered piece of fallen parchment with its tiny pink paws, and scampered on its merry way into a hole in one of the lower drawers. "Fucking hell," Charlie said, exhaling with relief. My paranoid ass just got jump-scared by a stupid rat. He slipped his knife back into its sheath, sauntered over to the exit, and gave the rusted handle a push. It swung outward with a crunch as it knocked aside a pile of densely packed snow, and a frigid gust of air blasted Charlie in the face. That would explain why it's so fucking cold. After raising a gloved hand to somewhat shield his face from the wind and the glare of the overcast sun, Charlie surveyed his surroundings. The first thing he noticed was the wall. Ringing the entire perimeter of the complex was a crude barbed wire fence, immediately beyond which rose a great palisade of sharpened logs and reinforced metal, although some areas had clearly been damaged by rot and the weather due to neglect over time. Just beyond each of the corners rose several tall structures, and below each of their snow-covered roofs gaped a set of large, windowless openings. Watchtowers of some kind, presumably. Charlie squinted. He couldn't see anyone moving within them, but he did catch a glimpse of the remains of a tattered red flag fluttering atop one of the buildings. Charlie's brow creased with concern as he hugged his arms tighter around himself in the cold. A stockade? That flag, the snow, the documents in Russian. Is this an old Soviet prison? On either side of him stood a line of buildings that all looked very similar to the one he had just exited, although in various states of rot and disrepair. The entire roof of the one next to him had caved in, presumably due to the weight of the snow that had once sat on top of it, although it was impossible to know exactly how long these buildings had been left to the elements like this. Directly in front of him, a frosted pathway led his gaze to a massive several-story structure that was evidently of greater importance than any of the others. It looked like a factory warehouse, and the foundations and supports that grounded it were fashioned entirely out of metal. It appeared to be far more structurally sound and relatively unscathed by the elements in comparison to the surrounding wooden buildings, which were all crumbling with rot, age, and weather damage. It looked a little out of place, almost as though it had been dropped into the prison grounds by the hand of some invisible giant. Even the layer of snow upon its slanting rooftop was thinner than the densely packed powder that suffocated the rest of the complex. Is this an abandoned gulag? Why the hell am I here? How did I get here? Where the fuck is everybody? Then again, weren't gulags abolished decades ago? I suppose that's why most of these buildings are in such a state of disrepair. But why is this monstrosity still standing? The wind whistled in his ears, but it stubbornly refused to provide him with answers. A storm was brewing. "Well, Alice," he said to himself through chattering teeth, "it's time to see what's down this Soviet rabbit hole." Shivering with cold and seeing nowhere else to turn to, Charlie wrapped his arms around himself and began to wade through the calf-high bank of snow towards the massive building that loomed ahead of him. At the very least, he could get some better shelter from the wind and possibly find some more resources. Maybe he could even locate a map or something that could tell him where the hell he was, or some clue as to why he was even there in the first place. When he reached the imposing set of double doors, Charlie was surprised to find that they swung open without much resistance, although the grating sound of the metal doors upon the metal flooring set his teeth on edge. The darkened interior was relatively spacious and had the appearance of a multi-level industrial factory that, while being gutted of most of its machinery, still retained remnants of its steel skeleton. Sheets of metal grating and darkened wood crisscrossed high above to form an interlocking catwalk, and the ceiling was supported by great columns of steel stained by rust, smoke, and oil. Large pipes weaved throughout the various levels of the building, like the digestive tract of some gargantuan mechanical organism. They laced between several great vats on the facility floor, and back up again to large vents in the ceiling that had long ago been blocked up. Very little sunlight pierced the frigid facility, as what few windows it possessed were covered by grime on the inside and frost on the outside. Charlie exhaled a shivery breath, which steamed in front of him like a puff of smoke in the bitter atmosphere, and his glasses began to fog up. Somehow, despite being shielded from the wind, the cold in this abandoned facility seemed to have an easier time seeping right through his clothes and down his spine than it did in the open air outside. "Hello?" he called tentatively, although he wasn't really expecting an answer. "Anybody in here?" His expectations were met. The room was silent, save for the eerie echo of his own voice. A few electrical light bulbs hung suspended from cables draping down from the ceiling. After wiping the fog from his glasses and taking a minute to search around the entrance, Charlie located a light switch. Here goes nothing. This place has probably been cut off from any source of power for eons at this point. There's no way this is going to work. Upon flipping the switch, however, a series of clangs reverberated throughout the building, and a loud buzzing filled the air as the bulbs above began to flicker to life, illuminating the facility in a sickly yellow light. Well, shit, I stand corrected. Now that the interior was properly lit, Charlie was able to spy what appeared to be an office on the level directly above him, overlooking the factory floor. He tested his weight on the first rung of the rusted old ladder which led directly up to it, and, finding that it remained intact, gingerly began his ascent. Upon reaching the top of the ladder, Charlie placed his hand on the floor above to hoist himself up, and immediately slammed it into the middle of a pile of glass shards. If it weren't for the gloves he was wearing, his palm would have been sliced to ribbons. He rose to his feet and carefully dusted off any remaining fragments. Upon further inspection, Charlie noticed that the window of the office had been shattered. That's weird. Why is the glass on the outside? Evidently, someone or something had broken out of the office rather than into it. Putting a pin in that thought, he cautiously stepped into the room. It was covered with a thick layer of dust and grime, but some papers pinned to the walls were still relatively intact. They contained diagrams of some sort. One was evidently a blueprint of the facility, and another detailed the inner workings of the pipe system. Something on the floor next to the well-worn desk caught Charlie's attention, an old SHM-41 gas mask. It was filthy. The olive-tinted rubber was torn and stained to the point of looking like a blackened rag, One of the lenses was broken, and the tube that should have been connected to the elongated face was missing entirely. Charlie bent down to get a better look at it, and noticed a pile of fallen infantry papers. He swiped them up and glanced at the headings. Bleach transport, 400 gallons of ammonia, hydrochloric acid and hazardous waste disposal unit? When I said it was time to go down the rabbit hole, I didn't mean that I wanted to leap straight into the Soviet Union's radioactive trash chute. He stepped out of the office and glanced back down towards the massive vats beneath him and the complex ventilation system that linked the huge vessels with the rest of the gargantuan building's various industrial organs. What were they trying to make here? Mustard gas or something? The Geneva Protocol's prohibition of chemical warfare certainly wasn't heeded by everyone, I guess. Then again, if they had no qualms about murder and forced labor, then they probably wouldn't give two shits about committing a few extra war crimes on the side, just to spice it up a little. A soft scuttling sound interrupted Charlie's internal monologue, and he rolled around to face the direction of the noise. Probably just another stupid rat, lemming, whatever they're called. He chuckled to himself for a second, but immediately stopped upon being aggrieved by the most putrid stench he had ever had the misfortune of smelling. Charlie reeled and immediately covered his mouth and nose with both hands. Christ, what the fuck is that? The scuttling, which had been emanating from inside the office, stopped short. In its place, a prolonged, viscid squelching, followed by muted chitter, caused Charlie's expression to contort from disgust into dread. He was about to move a tentative step closer to investigate the nauseating smell and strange noise when the scuttling started again. Whatever was in there was moving, and it was moving towards him. Charlie's heartbeat quickened, and he made an effort to quiet his fearful, uneven breaths. He glanced quickly behind him to locate the ladder, and nearly jumped right off the platform upon returning his gaze forward. At the top of the broken office window, upside down and peeking out at him from one of the corners of the shattered glass pane, was the gas mask. Slowly, it turned a full 180 degrees until it was right side up again, and the movement was followed by a wet slink as a loop of the tube, which had been missing but was now inserted through the mouthpiece, dangled downwards. Charlie's feet felt like they were bolted to the floor. He stared in horror as he realized that the tube was pulsating, like an artery or some other organ. It looked almost like a massive, elongated trachea that had been pulled straight out of some creature's throat. The mask twitched, and a string of something that looked like a mix of blood and saliva dripped from the living tubing onto the floor of the office below. Charlie's eyes widened as a gray skeletal hand, followed by an emaciated and freakishly long forearm, gripped the edge of the window. The creature pulled itself out of the office and clung onto the wall above it like some nightmarish spider. Its neck, spine, and limbs were all bent at impossible angles, but the ghastly mask remained in just the right orientation for the lenses to remain locked upon Charlie. Now that the creature had exited the office, its grotesque form was highlighted by the sickly yellow industrial bulbs, giving its twisted hide a jaundiced tint. The living tubing glinted in the light, moist with blood and spittle. It began at the mask's mouthpiece, looped several times around itself like an intestine, and disappeared somewhere in the creature's abdomen, which was scantily clad in a heavily torn and rotten garment that could perhaps have once passed as an officer's uniform. It stared at Charlie, and remained completely motionless while it clung to the wall. Charlie ever so slowly removed his hands from his mouth, glanced once more at the ladder behind him, and began to gauge how quickly he could make his escape. Upon turning his eyes forward again, the creature began crawling down towards him with horrifying speed and agility. As it rapidly closed the distance between them, Charlie could see a set of gnashing yellowed incisors just behind the broken lens. His amygdala finally processed the situation, and a single command reverberated throughout his whole being. "Run, you idiot!" Charlie threw himself at the ladder and scrambled to climb down as if his life depended on it, which it did. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek, like an unholy combination of an elk's bugling and the scream of a trumpet, and scuttled headfirst down onto the ladder's top few rungs. The rusted bars could only take so much weight. The entire ladder screeched as the rust gave way and the hinges wrenched themselves from the upper level of the facility. It fell with a deafening crash, and both Charlie and the creature sprawled onto the floor below. The wind was knocked completely out of Charlie's lungs, and he wheezed as he tried to catch his breath and rise from the ground. The abomination recovered much faster, and soon had its target within its grasp. The stench of rotting flesh overpowered Charlie's senses, and his retching made it difficult to breathe. The gas mask on the creature's head, which had all of this time been staring directly into Charlie's face, suddenly flipped backwards, spraying him with blood and saliva from the tube which was now wrenched free from the creature's abdomen. Charlie shrieked and fought desperately to find his knife, but noticed in dismay that it had fallen several feet away from him in the tumble from the ladder. The tube writhed, and the end that had fallen away from the monster's body turned towards him to reveal a gaping orifice filled with rows upon rows of tiny needle-like teeth, like some demonic worm. It lunged towards his chest, but hissed and reeled away upon making contact with Charlie's rusty cuirass. He shoved the creature's torso with all of his might and rolled away from the lunging mouth of the tube, and just about managed to grasp the hilt of his combat knife before the abomination had him pinned again. Charlie parried and batted away the chomping maw a few times before he finally saw an opening to strike. After parrying the lunging mouth one last time, he sliced the blade of his knife through the base of the tube, just below the mouthpiece of the gas mask. The tube fell to the floor, hissing and undulating like the decapitated head of a hydra, and a stream of rotting blood and saliva fell from the gaping hole that had been made by Charlie's blade. The abomination shrieked as it fell onto its back. Its body convulsed and its legs twitched uncontrollably like a dying arachnid. Charlie crawled backwards as fast as he could until his spine met with the cool surface of one of the empty vats. He sat there, staring straight ahead, breathing heavily and erratically, long after the creature had ceased its spasming. His mind was racing, spurred by residual adrenaline and fear. What the actual fuck was that? All I wanted was to shield my frozen ass from the goddamn winds of Siberia, but no. Are you my mummy? Do I look like... God just said, fuck you in particular today, Charlie. Time for you to meet Stephen King's grown-up edition of The Fucking Empty Child. What war crimes did I commit to deserve this? Huh? Last time I checked, I didn't order the goddamned Wish.com version of Venom that actually turned out to just be some guy who'd been dunked in radioactive waste. He clutched his knees tightly to his chest and sniffled. What the actual hell, man? Why me? Why am I here? After allowing his internal monologue to vent for a while, Charlie took a deep, shuddering breath. He slowly got to his feet and, trembling, walked ever so carefully towards the fallen creature. It was still, and its legs were curled up in the air like a deceased insect. Ichor was still draining from the hole in the mask, and the severed tube was lying curled into itself, completely motionless, several feet from its body. I wonder who they used to be. They could have been an officer in charge of running this place. Then again, they could have also been an inmate, maybe even someone like me. Upon examining the tattered clothing of the body, Charlie saw that the creature was wearing an old belt with a knife sheath and a holster like his own. Something glinted in the light. The pistol was still there. Someone who had power here then, I guess. They had it coming. Even so, I don't think anyone, no matter how fucking despicable, deserves a fate like this. Charlie delicately pulled the firearm from the holster. He raised it up to the light, and found that it was, miraculously, still intact, if not stained to hell and back. Beneath several layers of blood and filth, he was able to make out a number 9 carved into the wooden grip. Holy shit! It's a red 9! I could have really used this Mauser 5 minutes ago against Soviet Walmart venom. Damn. Better late than never, I guess. He wiped the worst of the grime off on his trousers before holstering the pistol on his own belt, and promptly turned back to exit the facility. Sayonara, radioactive building of death. May we never meet again. Unfortunately, Charlie had forgotten just why he had entered in the first place. Upon opening the doors, he was hit by a blast of freezing wind and swirling snow. The sunlight was almost completely gone, thanks to the density of the overcast storm clouds lingering above. Oh yeah, Siberia. Right. He closed the doors again, frozen to the bone. For the next half hour, making sure to give the creature's corpse a wide berth, Charlie scrounged around the ruins of the facility for any usable wood to make a fire out of. In the midst of his search, another stroke of good fortune struck him. He uncovered a collection of old crates behind one of the abandoned pieces of machinery, much like those in the supply room from earlier. Upon cracking them open, they presented him with a variety of ammunition. Most of the cartridges were unusable, but at the very bottom of the last crate, Charlie caught sight of several 9mm stripper clips. He excitedly stuffed as many as he could fit into his belt pouches, which sufficed in place of an actual bandolier. After removing the Red 9 from its holster, he pulled back the charging handle to lock it, placed one of the 10-round clips in front of the bolt, and fed the cartridges into the pistol's internal magazine with a satisfying set of clicks. Oh, hell yeah, baby! Charlie held the pistol out in front of him like he was posing for the opening credits of a James Bond film. Unable to resist, he turned to the contorted corpse of the gas mask abomination and pulled the trigger. Leon Kennedy ain't got nothing on me. If another one of those fuckers shows its ugly mug again, I'll be ready this time. The sound of the shot echoed loudly throughout the building, followed by a few beats of dead silence. Then the shadows on the walls started to waver. One of the hanging yellow bulbs high above Charlie's head began to rock back and forth. Another began to flicker. And then the chittering started up again. The noise erupted from every corner of the facility, and a crescendo of scuttling and clicking joined in the pandemonium. Charlie craned his neck upwards, and the blood drained from his face upon seeing a whole host of those masked abominations rapidly clambering down the walls, pipes, and support beams towards him. He turned tail and bolted towards the doors. Fuck, fuck, fuck! I spoke too soon! One! I said I could handle one of you! As he pushed open one of the metal doors, Charlie fired a few shots into the approaching swarm. One of the creatures fell to the floor with a howl before curling its legs up into defeat, but the others, unfazed, continued their rapid descent towards him. He pushed forward into the darkness of the storm, fighting against the wind and the snow. He could barely see what was in front of him, but all he knew was that he had to keep moving forward. The creature closest to his heels lunged at him, but Charlie managed to throw himself out of the way just in time. As it prepared to jump at him again, he fired a shot directly through the side of its gas mask. The bullet exploded out the other side, and the creature fell convulsing into the snow. 5 shots made, 5 left before I need to reload. He picked himself back onto his feet, and ran until he stumbled upon the perimeter of the barbed wire fence. Shit! If I can't find an exit, they'll surround me. Fortunately, the camp's state of disrepair worked out in Charlie's favor. It did not take long for him to locate an area where the entire fence had fallen to the ground and been covered by snow. The palisade beyond hadn't fared much better in the weather, and some of the logs had also toppled over to form an opening not too far from where he was running. There's my exit! Charlie waded through a dense pile of snow and fired another shot upon hearing a guttural hiss close behind him. 4. He made it to the broken palisade and scrambled across the fallen logs. Another creature launched itself at him, and he once again just managed to step to the side just in time before it could grapple him. It landed just beyond him, and he fired a shot straight through its neck before kicking its head for good measure. 3. The dense fir trees beyond the abandoned gulag looked like they might offer some semblance of salvation from the elements. Charlie's stamina was waning rapidly from the cold and overexertion, but he continued to sprint through the thick snow to put as much distance between himself and those monstrosities as possible. One of them had followed him beyond the border of the camp. Its long legs allowed it to scamper with ease over the powder, but it quickly latched itself onto a tree trunk near him and began to climb, readying itself to pounce. Charlie whirled and fired at it, but the shot narrowly missed and ricocheted off the trunk instead. 2. In his haste, Charlie neglected to watch the ground in front of him and tripped over a rock, landing directly into a snowbank. He threw himself onto his back and stared directly at the abomination as it loomed in the branches above him. It extended its fanged proboscis with a hiss, but the sound was cut short by Charlie firing a bullet straight through its abdomen. Viscera and fur needles sprayed the snow in front of him, and the creature fell with a whomp onto the ground. 1. He fired the last remaining cartridge directly through the abomination's head. The body convulsed for a second before it, too, finally expired. Save for Charlie's ragged breathing and the rustling of the tree branches in the wind, the world was silent. I've got to get somewhere warm before I freeze to death. He would hold off on processing what he had just gone through, only after he had located some shelter from the cold. He picked himself up off the ground with an exhausted groan, and then reloaded and holstered the pistol. Charlie clutched his arms around himself to conserve what little body heat he had left, feeling the true bite of the wind now as it seeped through his gambeson and clawed at his bones like some ravenous vulture feasting on any remaining scraps of warmth. With his mind plagued by fear and trained solely on the thought of survival, he began to trudge further into the darkening forest. In the corner of the bone-white examination room, illuminated by a light that was far too cold and blindingly bright, Rambo stared unblinking, face expressionless, into the space before him. He was lying on his side, with his head resting on his mechanical forearms, like one might imagine a lion or some other inhuman beast might do. He didn't know how long he had been lying there, alone, in that silent, empty room. If it hadn't been for the light, he almost wouldn't have minded the silence. Almost. Rambo had no way of knowing how much time had passed since he had awoken. After those robotic arms had fastened that disciplinary harness on him, and he had fallen to the ground, the surgical table had retracted into the floor, as did all of the remaining arms. He had scarcely moved a muscle since, only to move himself further into the corner of the room so as to reclaim but a hint of the feeling of security. The CCTV camera was locked on him, eyeing him like a hawk eyes a mouse in the field before it snatches it up in its claws. Rambo refused to look at it, continuing instead to stare directly into the emptiness in front of him. Hetch had stopped talking to him over the speaker at around the same time the table had disappeared, supposedly to prepare a new test of some sort, thereby leaving Rambo alone with his thoughts. What is all this for? Why bring me back, only to turn me into this? Why would anybody want this? To see this? To be this? He continued staring forward. While he feared the light, wanting nothing more than to close his eyes, to shut it out and return to the dark, he feared the prospect of being electrocuted even more. The pain in his face, throat, and limbs had faded to a dull but ever-present throb. It lingered, but it was manageable. The sudden white-hot bolt of a disciplinary shock, on the other hand, was an agony he wasn't eager to experience again any time soon. A new pain had begun to gnaw at him as time passed, however, one that clawed at his insides, begging to be acknowledged. Something raw and primal. Hunger. How long it had been since he had last eaten, or even had anything to drink, Rambo couldn't hazard a guess. His memory of anything before that red room with its iron jaws was hazy at best, and he sure as hell hadn't a clue how much time had passed between when he had passed and when he had woken up in this room. His stomach growled, but still he did not move. The speaker, however, crackled to life. "You must forgive me. Where are my manners?" the director drawled. "It must have been ages since you've last had a bite to eat. We can't have you going on stage feeling famished now, can we?" Rambo refused to look at the camera to acknowledge Hedge's voice, but his right eye twitched ever so slightly. "You must be utterly ravenous. Why not have a little something to sink your teeth into?" Rambo shamefully noticed that he had subconsciously begun to salivate at the mere mention of food, but stubbornly continued to lie there, motionless in protest. "I'm not your fucking pet. I'll lay here and starve myself before I eat anything offered by your bloodied hands." A section of the wall opposite him suddenly opened, and a figure stepped into the room. It wasn't anyone Rambo recognized, nor were they wearing the typical mask and uniform of a showfall drone. They just looked normal, like any random person one would pass on the street. What's going on here? Who is this? Why put them in here with me? Rambo stared at the figure, but remained where he was, unmoving. The person, on the other hand, gave a start when they saw Rambo curled up in the corner. They took one look at his inhuman limbs and the light that reflected with an eerie red glint from his eye before whirling around to face the door from which they had entered, but it was gone. It had sealed shut almost immediately once they had set foot inside the blindingly white room. They slowly turned back around, eyes wide with fear, breathing heavily in rising panic. Rambo could swear he could hear the figure's heart beating in their chest, rapidly, like that of a petrified rabbit. Still, he remained motionless. "Well?" the voice over the speaker asked expectantly. "Aren't you keen for a bite?" Realization dawned. He wants me to eat them? The horror of the thought made Rambo's blood run cold. There's no way I'm hurting this person, let alone eating them. That's barbaric. They can't make me. Despite the hunger which clawed at his gut in protest, Rambo shifted himself so that his head was facing away from the terrified person who was shivering against the wall opposite him. "Come now, you'll waste away if you refuse to eat." This time, Rambo turned his head back around to glare directly into the CCTV camera. "No." We can't deny our audience the chance to interact with one of our main features. We need you, Rambo. You must eat. Rambo hardened his defiant stare. Let me rephrase that, Hedge paused. You can, and you will. This is your last warning. No, I won't. He steeled himself for the pain he knew was coming and squeezed his eyes shut. At least he would get some respite from the light. The shock that passed through Rambo's nervous system was worse than any of the others he had yet received. It felt like someone had replaced the blood that ran through his veins with acid and lit his whole body ablaze. The pain caused him to leap to his feet and cry out in anguish, and the mask flew open as he did so to reveal the countless rows of predatorial teeth that lay within. After a second or two, the initial agony passed, and he fell to the ground again, breathing heavily on all fours like a wounded animal. The damage was done. The stranger opposite him had screamed upon hearing his agonized roar, thinking that their life would soon be cut short by the claws of the inhuman monstrosity on the other side of the room. Rambo panted while he recovered from the shock. He began to growl, a low and menacing sound, but the threat wasn't directed at the figure cowering in the corner. His glare was focused on the camera lens that was still watching him with great intent. I said no! Finally showing some defiance, I see. About time, Hetch taunted over the speakers. I was wondering when you would. Your weepy reactions were entertaining for a while, but were getting rather tiresome and repetitive. The audience loves a bit of stubbornness in the face of peril. It adds nuance, flavor. At that, a small compartment opened in the wall next to him, and a mechanical arm unraveled. It pointed something towards the whimpering figure on the opposite side of the room, and a loud bang reverberated throughout the small space. Rambo stared in horror as the person's back hit the wall with a wet thud, and slowly slid down before toppling over to the side like a discarded rag doll. The snow-white paneling was now smeared with crimson, and a steady trickle of it oozed down from a hole that gaped in the middle of their forehead. Their expression was still frozen in fear, cemented there forever now that life had fled from their veins. They were a person no more. A mere object had taken their place. The smell of blood was alluring. The scent emanated slowly from the body, spilling into every corner of the room, tainting the atmosphere with the metallic stench of iron. The hunger that gnawed at Rambo's insides now felt like it was devouring him whole. His mouth watered, but he swallowed defiantly. Something primal was trying to claw its way to the surface, but he forced it down. No. No, I will not become what they want me to become. I will not desecrate the corpse of another one of Shofal's victims. Wasn't my own enough? The director mused. Perhaps this plot du jour is not to your liking. No matter, it shall not go to waste. The door in the wall opened once more, and 2 masked drones entered the room. They marched immediately to the crumpled body of the stranger, hoisted it up without seeming to care that their uniforms were now stained with gore, and carried it out without a word. A mindless thing to be disposed of. The opening shut. The blood remained, and the hunger grew. Charlie's hands shook violently as he tried again and again to get his knife blade to produce a spark from the cold piece of flint that he had been striking over and over again for the past 20 minutes. After wandering the dense forest for what had felt like an eternity, he had stumbled upon a clearing in the trees through which a creek, not yet frozen over, passed through. The frigid but shallow water ran over thousands of well-worn river stones, and Charlie had been fortunate enough to locate a small deposit of flint near the bank that he was able to access without having to place more than his foot into the freezing water. After pocketing several bits of the river-worn flint, and a few hefty handfuls of fallen pine and fir needles, Charlie took shelter from the biting winds behind a collection of large boulders, and doffed his belt and rusty body armor. He had the intuition to build a little stick platform a few inches off the snow to place his kindling on top of so as to keep it as dry as possible, but despite his best efforts, the rocks stubbornly refused to give off a spark. Shit, it's probably still damp from the river. I'll freeze to death at this rate. Almost as if cued by his thought, a single spark suddenly jumped from the flint upon his blade's next impact. It landed squarely on top of the pile of dried needles, and the kindling gradually began to smoke. Yes! Finally! He exclaimed through chattering teeth. Charlie leaned his face close to the small flame and blew a gentle gust of air over it, and the rest of the kindling ignited. He scooted himself closer to his makeshift fire, took off his gloves, and began to warm his shivering hands. He smiled with relief as he felt the frost on his lashes begin to melt, and the frames of his glasses no longer felt like shards of dry ice burning his face. It wasn't long before Charlie's eyelids began to droop. The comforting warmth and glow of the fire, coupled with the exhaustion he had felt after escaping the monsters in the prison camp, gradually lulled him to sleep. His dreams were fitful, plagued by fleeting visions of blood and moments of terror. In his unconscious state, Charlie couldn't determine whether they were nightmares brought upon by the horrors he had just fled from, or whether they were memories that had come back to haunt him. Blurred visages of familiar faces flitted before his mind's eye. The glint of a stage light off of the surface of an old television screen, a room flooded with blood-red light, the grating sound of metal, the tearing of flesh. Charlie awoke with a start, a cold sweat dripping down the back of his neck. The sun had just begun to peek its rays out over the edges of the rocks he was sheltering behind, and his makeshift fire was down to its last dying embers. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, his stomach grumbled loudly for attention. It was only then that he realized that he had no idea when he had last eaten anything, or had anything to drink, for that matter. At least there's plenty of snow around. I should probably boil it first, just to be safe, but I didn't exactly have time to pick up a pot or kettle at Communist Target on the way out here. Screw it, it'll have to do. He picked himself up off the ground and winced. After unbuttoning his gambeson, he lifted up a section of his linen shirt and noticed that some heavy bruising had begun to form on his side and wrapped around his lower back, likely received in the fall from the ladder during his delightful encounter with the first gas mask creature. Upon closer inspection, he frowned. In an area of his abdomen that wasn't bruised, he saw a faint line of mottled pink and white scarring where his skin had healed over some expertly made stitches. Where did this come from? How long has it been there? Charlie's stomach growled again and interrupted his train of thought. He shook his head, rebuttoned his gambeson, and grumbled while he struggled to put on the old body armor again. After it was secured and his belt was tightly put in place, he made his way around the tall rocks that had sheltered him during the night. After a minute or two of walking through dense powder, he located an undisturbed patch of snow that was free from any kind of detritus or fallen needles. Well, time to dig in, I guess. At least it's not yellow. As Charlie bent down to pick up a handful of the snow to quench his thirst, a crackling sound made him turn his head. Pressure suddenly built up in his ears and then equalized as the crackling grew louder. He whirled around several times, scanning the trees for any sign of those creatures, but the forest remained undisturbed. He strained his ears, and only then noticed that the sound was emanating from somewhere above him. Charlie squinted, but as he was in a clearing, there was nothing there but empty space. Where the fuck is that coming from? Am I losing my mind? He continued in vain to search the skies for answers, when he was suddenly blown right off of his feet by a shockwave of heat and light. The snow around him had half melted into a pile of muddy slush, and Charlie landed in it with a thud. He craned his neck upwards, and his eyes widened in shock and wonder. There was a hole in the sky. It looked like a bloody gash had been ripped open in empty space. The rift was jagged, uneven, and rays of scarlet light bled through it onto the clearing below. It hummed with energy, and an occasional discharge of ruby electricity crackled around the edges. As Charlie stared at the rift, it began to grow. Its perimeter widened until what was originally just a thin tear became a gaping aperture, and the ruddy light washed over him. His ears then picked up on a faint noise, distinct from the electrical hum of the rift. Is that someone yelling? A definite scream grew quickly in volume, like someone was falling from a great height, and before Charlie could begin to process what was happening, something large and metallic hurtled from the mouth of the rift. He yelped and scrambled to the side, narrowly escaping being crushed by the object as it crashed loudly beside him. He squeezed his eyes shut and threw his arms up to shield his face from flying debris. After taking a second to acknowledge that he was in fact not obliterated by a space rock, Charlie opened his eyes and slowly lowered his quivering hands. The rift was gone. He turned to investigate what had landed beside him, and his mouth hung open upon seeing that the large hunk of metal that had fallen from the tear in the sky was not an asteroid at all. It looked like some kind of futuristic motorcycle. The large front fender and cowling were thick, streamlined, and painted in a sleek and dark navy, as were the body fairings. At the intersections of each part glowed a rich cerulean light, but it quickly flickered and dimmed. There was no fork or axle to be seen. The underside of the fenders were smooth, and also weakly shimmered with that same dying blue light. One of the wheels was missing entirely, and the other was lying a ways away from the vehicle. What surprised Charlie was that it was not made of any kind of rubber, but instead looked like it was also made of metal. It had a cobalt sheen to it, and the hollow interior, like the fender, also glowed cerulean. What kind of sci-fi bullshit did I just stumble into? A groan from behind the opposite side of the vehicle made Charlie jump. Fuck. Charlie immediately unholstered his C-96. Luckily, he had remembered to reload it after his encounter at the prison. Who are you? What the hell just happened? What was that? Charlie asked in a commanding tone with far more confidence than he actually felt. The voice from behind the vehicle coughed. Why don't you show yourself first, and then maybe I'll consider talking to you? Charlie hesitated. Holding his pistol at the ready, he slowly made his way around the motorcycle's obstructive fairing. The stranger was leaning with his back against the vehicle with one hand resting on his stomach and the other lying limply to his side, away from Charlie. He was clothed in what looked like techwear ripped straight from a cyberpunk movie, complete with black cargo pants with too many hanging straps and an oversized phthalo blue jacket with matte white and glowing cerulean trimmings. He had a blue baseball cap to match, under which poked out several strands of wavy brown hair. A set of lapis-colored headphones rested over the cap, and were inlaid with flickering cyan embellishments and an icon of a dark navy spade over each ear. The stranger's face was obscured by a dark fabric mask, and only his eyes were visible. They stared out at Charlie from under a heavy brow with a look of extreme mistrust. The stranger gave him a wary once-over. He didn't seem fazed at all by the pistol that was aimed right at him, but he reacted viscerally upon seeing the white and black logo that was embroidered on Charlie's gambeson. "You're with them?" the stranger cried, his tone a threatening mix of anger and fear. Despite the obvious pain it caused him, he reached around to the motorcycle beside him and slammed his fist on some hidden button on the side, and a compartment hissed open. "Who the fuck is them?" Charlie exclaimed, his pistol shaking in his quivering grip. "Stay the hell away from me, asshole!" the stranger yelled as he pulled a straight-up rifle out from the center of the motorcycle and pointed it right at Charlie's panicked face. The barrel was long and rectangular, and both it and the stock, much like the vehicle, were fashioned out of a dark navy material and embellished with cerulean lights. Not knowing what else to do, Charlie dropped his Mauser onto the ground and held up his hands in surrender. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, chill! I swear to you, I have no idea who they are, or where you came from, or where I came from, or what this logo is, or what the hell is happening. Just don't shoot," he pleaded. The stranger said nothing for a moment, and regarded him carefully. Charlie could almost hear the cogs turning in his brain as he mulled over what to do with him. "You're not with Showfall?" the stranger asked tentatively, the barrel of the rifle still raised. No, I don't even know what that is." The stranger looked like he was about to ask him another question when a violent fizzing noise started emanating from the fallen vehicle. A look of panic flashed in his eyes. "Shit! Get down!" he yelled as he forced himself up and jumped towards Charlie. He knocked him over into the snow and covered both of their heads with the fabric from his massive jacket. The fizzing noise cut out, followed by a deafeningly loud electrical explosion that sounded like somebody had strapped 10 pounds of C4 to the back of a giant prehistoric wasp. The ground shook violently for a few seconds, and neither Charlie nor the stranger moved until the world was silent and still again. The man took his arm away, dropped the rifle to the side, and allowed himself to fall backwards onto the ground. He pulled down his cloth mask so he could breathe more easily, revealing a rounded and unshaven face. Something about this man struck Charlie as familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Fuck, and I thought electromagnetic traversal was supposedly all-terrain safe. I guess going ass first through a fucking wormhole doesn't fall under that umbrella. The stranger chuckled mirthlessly to himself before a round of coughing interrupted him. Charlie sat up and stared at the smoking ruins of the motorcycle for a second before turning to face the man who had just saved his life. "Why did you do that?" "Do what?" "Save me, after being so suspicious of me. Why not just save yourself?" The stranger paused. "Judging from how you spoke earlier, you're obviously not a Showfall employee. At the very least, not knowingly, or by choice. Those bastards wouldn't bother speaking before shooting, and you don't have a mask. They probably would never allow themselves to show genuine fear, and to make them look weak. And they very obviously are the type of people who would want everyone else to think they're always in control at all times." Charlie didn't know why, but that statement didn't sound right to him. A faint memory of histrionic laughter and a deceptively earnest-sounding voice flickered in his mind, and he pinched the bridge of his nose to get himself to concentrate. "And what is Showfall, exactly?" The man sat back up with a grunt. They're the directors, producers of all this. This? What do you mean by this? You know. He waved his hands around, gesturing at the remnants of the motorcycle, the mud on the ground, the snow-covered trees. This? Charlie frowned in confusion, and the stranger gave an exasperated sigh. What's your name? He asked, looking Charlie directly in the eyes. Charlie? Pleasure to make your acquaintance, the stranger said in a mockingly formal tone. The name's Sneaksnag, or just Sneeg. Now you better buckle the fuck up, Charlie, because none of this is fucking real. Charlie stared at him. He thought of the bruises on his back, the fear he had felt while fleeing for his life, the cold that had frozen him to the core. All of that certainly felt real, wasn't it? Look, Sneeg continued, this is obviously a lot to take in. I get it. When I first found out the truth, I was fucking terrified. But the sooner you accept it, the sooner we can look for a way out of here. What? Do you still not get it? Think for a second. Where would you say you are right now? Charlie thought back to the documents he had seen. Somewhere in Siberia, I think? I just escaped from an abandoned prison. As he spoke, he realized just how utterly ridiculous his words sounded. Sneeg scoffed to himself. A fucking gulag? Wow, these assholes really are going for every stereotypical video game setting in the book, huh? He returned his gaze to Charlie. And you survived a winter's night in Siberia, with nothing but that jacket and a rusty breastplate. I had a fire, Charlie said, failing to convince even himself. A fire. Mm-hmm. And you just so happened to find some convenient fire-starting materials just lying around? Sneeg glanced at the pistol on the ground. And let me guess, you also just happened to find a perfectly intact and functioning Red 9, with ammo to boot, in an abandoned prison that is at least, several decades old? Charlie was silent. And what about that flimsy gambeson of yours, and that body armor? Where'd you get these clothes that just so happened to perfectly fit you? Charlie stuttered. I don't know. I woke up and they were just there. Sneeg clicked his tongue. Bingo. And I bet you don't remember much from before then, right? Charlie shook his head. Sneeg sighed. Same goes for me, too. A few weeks ago, I woke up in some kind of facility that was all decked out in these tacky-ass sci-fi lights, already wearing this outfit that made me look like I'd stepped right out of Tron or something. I was lucky enough to find some weapons, like this beaut right here. He patted the stock of the firearm next to him. An electromagnetic coil rifle. Shoots ferrobullets, or anything small and magnetic that you can shove in there. Turns out I was right when I thought lasers were the future. It's all magnets, baby. He paused to collect his thoughts again. Where was I? Oh yeah, dystopian cyberpunk Tron world. Right. Anyway, I had no idea where I was or how I got there, only that I wanted to find my way out. Some convenient resources found their way to me, as well as a whole bunch of cleverly planted expositional documents. They were written in binary, by the way, which I could somehow miraculously read as easily as if it were my first language. Charlie frowned, suddenly remembering how strange it was that he could fluently read Russian with no problem whatsoever. Sneeg continued. I discovered that the place was apparently built in the year 2109, and then it was taken over by sentient robots, and that all of humanity, except for myself apparently, had either been wiped out or turned into spooky evil cyborgs. You know, real Skynet type shit. Charlie was desperately trying to follow along with the story. So, how does your showfall thing factor into all of that? I'm getting to that. Sneeg held up a hand. So, for several days, I just ran around this facility trying not to die, shooting robots and killing cyborgs. That kind of stuff. But then I noticed something. Every time I thought I had cleared out that building, all of them would just appear again. What was weird was that there was no possible way they could have entered the facility, as all of the windows were bolted shut, and the only exit was through the underground motorcycle garage I'd been sheltering in. I would have known if anything came through there. And yet, every day, when I would enter the building again, there they were, all in the exact same positions they'd been before. Why didn't you leave the building in the first place? You said there was an exit in the garage. I would have, smartass, but none of the motorcycles worked, and I wasn't about to set foot into the middle of a sci-fi city filled with murderous robots without some form of decent transportation. Some of my wonderfully convenient knowledge just unsuspiciously happens to be in the hyper-specific field of futuristic electromagnetic automobile mechanics. So I stayed in the building to harvest parts from all those robots I killed so I could fix a bike and leave. But you're missing the point. Charlie's head was swimming. Which is, the robots respawned, dumbass. That's when it hit me. The absurdity of it all, my weirdly applicable niche knowledge, the respawning enemies. I was in a video game. I didn't know how, or why, or for how long, but it's the only scenario that makes any of this make any fucking sense. Charlie laughed. A video game? You can't be serious. Sneak gave him a frustrated look. Why the fuck would I joke about this? Of course I'm serious. I thought I was stupid too at first, but then I decided to test the theory. After I had acquired enough parts to fix one of the motorcycles, I did just that, but chose not to leave. I went back in, killed another one of the cyborgs, and hid myself in a vent. I waited for fucking hours, but it paid off. At around the time I'd estimated that the reset period usually took place, I heard the sound of some kind of electrical pulse, and some random guy wearing a suit that definitely did not fit with the futuristic setting, as well as a mask bearing this fucking logo. Here, Sneak reached a hand into one of his pockets and pulled out a frayed black and white patch that looked identical to Charlie's. Just walks right past my vent and picks up the cyborg's corpse. You had a patch too? Charlie asked. Yep, on the sleeve of my jacket before I ripped it off, Sneak replied as he stuffed the patch back into his pocket. An image of a person, multiple persons, wearing suits and masks that matched Sneak's description, briefly flashed through Charlie's mind. He had seen that logo before. But where? When? It was a drone, Charlie said quietly, almost without realizing it himself. Yeah, I guess you could call it that. Anyway, I wasn't going to let the opportunity go to waste, so I kicked open the vent and, kinda knocked him unconscious. You what? But he had the same logo as you. Couldn't he have helped? Well, clearly he wasn't on my side if he had a hand in replacing the things that were trying to kill me. Fair enough. In any case, I searched the guy's body and found this weird-looking knife with a red blade. When I picked it up, it started vibrating. It freaked me the fuck out, but I thought that the whole situation was already weird enough as it was, so I held on to it. When I turned around, it started vibrating more aggressively, like it was trying to point me somewhere. So I just kind of followed it. Where did it take you? The thing led me to one of those red rifts, like the one I just fell out of. The guy, or drone as you called him, evidently came from there. Did you go through? Of course I did. Spooky red portal. Probably the closest thing I was going to get to answers. Also, who wouldn't want to walk through a spooky red portal? Charlie's face contorted in thought for a second. Didn't that seem a little convenient? Like maybe it was also part of the game? Perhaps. But what other choice did I have? I wasn't just going to leave and follow whatever script they'd had written for me. Charlie didn't respond, but a worrisome thought passed through his mind. What if going through the portal was the script they wanted you to follow? If none of this is real or unscripted, why would that part be? Sneak continued talking, and Charlie let the thought pass without dwelling on it further. In any case, I went through the rift and found myself in some kind of, I don't know what to call it, a warehouse storage facility? He looked away, eyes unfocused and distant. There must have been hundreds of them. Hundreds of cyborgs, all completely identical to the one I'd repeatedly killed. They were all standing completely still, like they were dead or frozen. They didn't react to me being there at all. It would have been less freaky if they were robots, being mass-produced and all, but the cyborgs were still at least part human, and they were all the same. It's like they were clones or something. It scared me. Sneak rubbed his eyes. There was a sign above one of the big warehouse doors. If I remember correctly, it said something like Anathema, Cyborg number 026, or some other string of numbers. I think that's what those particular clones must have been called. Maybe there were more chambers with other types of clones. I don't know. Charlie thought back to the monsters from the prison. The rotting gas masks, the putrid smell, that awful chittering. He hated dwelling on them, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that they too had all looked the same. He just hadn't noticed before in his haste to run away. I think I encountered something similar, he spoke up. Oh? Spooky Soviet zombies, was it? Judging by your designated costume, that would be my guess. Sort of? Charlie shivered, and the bruise on his side and back began to ache at the memory. They looked like people, but wrong. Their limbs had too many joints, and their faces looked like they'd been fused with an old gas mask. They walked on walls and had these freaky tube mouths, like those weird suction cup eels with teeth. Lampreys? I think? Sneak barked a humorless laugh. So while I got a cool gun and sci-fi drip, you had zombie communist eels in a shitty breastplate? You poor bastard. Yeah. An awkward silence lingered for a few uncomfortable seconds before Charlie broke it. That's how I got my pistol, actually. He picked it up from where he had dropped it onto the snow and rotated it in his hands. I killed the first thing with my combat knife, and it just had the gun on its belt. Sneak smirked like he had just won an argument. So what you're telling me is that you literally received loot from a random monster you killed in the form of a weapon upgrade. Charlie was about to protest, but the proposed explanation just made too much sense. If this is all just a game, then why not just... He trailed off and fiddled with his hands. Sneak looked at him expectantly and raised an eyebrow. Charlie avoided his eyes. I don't know. Why not just die? Shouldn't we wake up somewhere? Sneak remained silent for a second, and then looked towards the remnants of the motorcycle. Do you really want to take that chance? Charlie didn't know. To avoid answering the question, he opted to change the subject. So, what happened after you saw the cyborg clones? Oh yeah, Sneak sat up straighter, energized by the return to his story. Evidently, the guy I had knocked out had woken up and set off some kind of alarm, because some loud sirens started blaring with a voice over the speaker and everything. Renegade has breached Anathema Annihilation, Level 1 Containment, was what it said. I remember that clear as day. That's when it first hit me that this whole shit show might be some kind of VR game. Literally nothing else could have as dramatic a name as Anathema Annihilation. I started freaking the fuck out, but I knew I didn't have time to have a crisis over what was real and what wasn't until I was somewhere safe. I didn't want to go back through the portal, but the door at the end of the facility opened up, and a bunch more of those masked guys came in, each carrying some kind of sci-fi firearm like the one I had, so I had no choice but to go back the way I came. I ran back through the rift and down to the garage, although I had to pick off a few more of those drones on the way down. They must have activated a few of the clones that were on standby, too. There were way more of them in the building than there usually were, and they all had that same, I guess you could say, character model. I nearly got to the garage unscathed, but one of the masked fuckers got a lucky shot and grazed my calf. At this, Sneak bent his right trouser leg and pointed to a large hole in the back of it, evidently where some kind of projectile had gone through. The fabric was bloodied. Charlie hadn't noticed it before. Sneak winced as he moved his leg back into a more comfortable position. Not too serious, though. Didn't hit my Achilles or any major arteries, thank God. Still fucking hurts, though. You should probably bandage that, Charlie said. With what? Sneak threw up his arms and gestured to himself. All my clothes are practically made of plastic and LEDs, and I didn't exactly see a CVS while I was falling ass over head through a rift in space-time. Charlie just rolled his eyes, took his combat knife out of its sheath, and cut off a strip of cloth from the sleeve of his linen shirt. Use this. I know it's not exactly medical-grade clean, but it's better than having you bleed out everywhere. Thanks, Sneak said before tentatively taking the piece of cloth and tying it tightly over the wound. I, appreciate it. Charlie just nodded. No problem. I take it you were able to get out of the garage? Sneak grinned. Hell yeah, I did. Popped a ferro bullet right through the mask of the guy who hit me before I made it downstairs. I had already finished the work I needed to do on the bike, so I stashed my rifle in its central compartment and left that godforsaken place in the dust. He paused for a second, and the smile dropped from his face as his eyes unfocused again. I drove for a while without knowing where I was going, and stopped for a bit under an overpass. Caught my breath, had a brief panic attack, you know, the usual response to just escaping a horde of people who want to kill you and having your entire sense of reality crumble beneath your feet. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds, until Sneak refocused his eyes and turned his head back to Charlie to resume his story. Of course, those bastards weren't going to let me have a moment of peace alone with myself. They must have had a backup collection of working vehicles somewhere, because it wasn't long before a whole bunch of them had just caught up with me. They had these big-ass six-wheeled cars and shit, too, not just motorcycles like mine. Did they open another one of those portal things? Sneak raised a finger. I'm getting to that. I'm sure as hell not going to skip the part about the dopest car chase of all time. He leaned in, eyes alight with enthusiasm, like he was describing a scene from an action movie, instead of something he had just narrowly survived. You saw those weird metal wheels on my bike, right? One of them, yeah, Charlie nodded, remembering how strange it looked. How are they attached without a fork? Wouldn't they just not work? He asked in confusion. Sneak clapped his hands together. Magnets, baby! It's all magnets! No fork or axle needed! They weren't oriented vertically like normal wheels, but instead were suspended horizontally by an electromagnetic field. And the beauty of that means that those wheels could align themselves at almost any point around the front and back fenders while keeping the body of the bike in place, like massive floating ball and socket joints. Charlie raised an eyebrow. And that means I could drive up walls, my guy. And those things literally didn't touch the ground. They were all-terrain certified. If you could literally drive up walls, how do they follow you? Well, obviously I wasn't the only one who could drive up walls, now was I? That's where the fun came in, if you could call being chased through miles-long subway tunnels upside down and up the sides of giant skyscrapers while trying to avoid being shot in the back, or having my vehicle explode while I was driving it at 200 miles per hour. Fun, that is. How the fuck did you not crash? Sneak tapped a finger to his temple. I guess Shofal thought that being awesome at not dying in futuristic motorcycle chases would be a good skill to add to my repertoire. I felt like Neo in the Matrix after he learned how to fly a helicopter. He paused for a second. That being said, I wonder what else I can do. Or what you can do, for that matter. Charlie thought about everything he had done over the past day, and how many of his own skills had felt strangely new to him. I can read Russian now, I guess, he said. And apparently not die while being out in the snowstorm for an extended period of time, if that counts. Sneak lightly punched his arm. Lame. Hey, maybe I just haven't had the chance to activate my superpowers yet, or whatever the hell you want to call it. If this all really is some kind of video game, maybe I just need some more XP. Kill some more bad guys. We'll see, Sneak chuckled. Anyway, back to me being cool and stuff. I could tell that I wasn't going to lose those guys just by driving fast up the sides of various random buildings, so I had to get creative. That's where this baby came in. At this point, he reached into another one of his pockets and revealed... A red stick? Charlie asked, unimpressed. No, you idiot, the portal knife. Granted, the blade's no longer there. This is just the hilt, but still. Hey, without the blade, you can't lie and say it doesn't just look like a red stick. Whatever, Sneak waved his hand in dismissal. Anyway, I used the blade to cut some doorways for myself in an effort to get away from those masked guys. The rifts sealed on their own pretty quickly. It might have been something to do with distance away from the blade, or at least that's my current theory. So I managed to lose a few of them, but some of the bastards that had managed to stay right on my ass were able to follow me through before the portal closed. Where did it take you? Somewhere around here? No, somewhere else. Another realm? Environment? Level? Whatever it wasn't your so-called Siberia. The first portal took me to what looked like 19th century London in the middle of the night, with people wearing top hats and trench coats and riding in carriages and all that. I was only there for about a minute, but I could have sworn I heard howling. I'd honestly place my bets on the theme of that place being werewolves. It fit the stereotype well enough. Werewolves? Hey, if you came from a horror shooter type world, like Resident Evil or something, and I came from what was presumably a shitty Cyberpunk 2077 ripoff, what's to stop Shofar from abusing other popular tropes for their settings? If not stereotypical werewolves, maybe they just copied Bloodborne's aesthetic instead. That's also a possibility. Charlie's head swam. How many of these fake worlds are out there? Are there other people like us trapped there? Were there others here in this one before me? He swallowed, trying to force down his growing anxiety. You said first portal. I'm guessing that you made more? Sneak nodded. After cutting a hole through the fabric of werewolf fill, I landed in a desert in the middle of butt-fuck nowhere. Somehow, Shofal managed to make the whole environment look like it had that Breaking Bad filter over it, making everything look like it was stained with sulfur, or piss. The what filter? Sneak ignored the question. Whatever the case, I sure as hell wasn't going to stick around in that place for long. At least 3 other guys had made it through that last portal. But just as I was finishing cutting out another rift, one of those asshats shot my rear wheel at an angle just right to throw the electromagnetic field connection to the fender out of alignment, and it flew clean off. I heard the blade of my knife crack and just about managed to steer through the portal using only my front wheel, but quickly regretted it. Charlie was hanging on to Sneak's every word, the enthusiasm of a child being told an exciting bedtime story. Why? What happened? Void. Void? Or sky, I guess. I was just fucking falling through empty space with no ground in sight. I didn't have a fear of heights before, but I sure as fuck do now. Sneak stared off into space again and wrapped his arms around himself. None of the showfall drones followed me through. I guess they didn't want to get trapped in an endless freefall either. The knife was definitely damaged, but I sure as hell wasn't going to stay sitting on a falling motorcycle until the end of time. I obviously couldn't stop the bike from moving to cut a clean rift, so I just threw it and hoped for the best. And that fucking worked? Sneak gestured to the wreckage around them. I'm alive, and no longer hurtling through space, so I'd say so, yeah. The blade shattered, but the hilt came through the rift with me. I pocketed it after I landed gracefully on my face in a pile of snow. I'm not going to question how I survived that fall. I'm just going to chalk it up to weird portal physics and video game logic. And, well, you know the rest. They sat in silence for a while, both mulling over the insanely strange experiences they'd both had, before Charlie's stomach so rudely interrupted the moment. This might be a stupid question, he grimaced, but how did you find food while you were in the facility? The corner of Sneak's mouth raised in a half smile. There was surprisingly no shortage of canned food in that facility's storeroom. Unfortunately, I don't have any more on me. But what we do have are 2 firearms and the combined will to live, so I'm sure that we'll be able to find something. Siberia or not, this is a forest. It's bound to have at least a few game animals. Once we catch something and fuel up, we can look for a way out of here. Together? Well, I haven't exactly met anyone else that hasn't tried to kill me on sight yet, although I guess you did pull a gun on me, but I'll let that slide. So yeah, together. Charlie's spirits perked up at the thought of food, but even more so at the notion that he wasn't going to have to face this world alone. Sounds like a plan to me. They both stood up, brushed the dirt and snow from their clothes, and holstered their weapons, Charlie's pistol and combat knife on his belt, and Sneak's rifle in his back. Just before setting off in search of tracks, Sneak turned and held out his hand. Vagabond and renegade, duo of the fucking century? Vagabond, huh? Sure has a ring to it. Charlie clasped his hand and shook it firmly. For the first time since he had woken into this nightmare, he felt hope. Duo of the fucking century! Some hours after the pair of showfall drones had exited the room bearing the stranger's body, something had rendered Rambo unconscious. He awoke an unknown amount of time later, and was surprised to find that his harness was now gone. But the hunger remained. He was restless. Every one of Rambo's senses was on edge, overstimulated. The lights burned his eyes, the electrical hum of the glaring LED bulbs overhead droned harshly in his ears, and his whole body ached, not yet recovered from the last shock. The worst assault on his senses, however, was a pervasive stench of the blood that still coated the otherwise pristine white walls and floor. The smell filled the room like a miasma. It was inescapable. Rambo couldn't shut it out. He had no nose to plug, and yet he could still perceive it. His mask must have been outfitted not only with a reconstructed mouth, but some kind of vomeronasal organ as well. Every time he inhaled, the signature taste of blood was imprinted on the very air he breathed. To distract himself from the oppressive pangs of hunger that had been gnawing at him for hours, Rambo had a mind to begin pacing the room. He shakily rose onto his feet, stumbling several times before managing to stand upright. He wasn't yet used to his new digitigrade anatomy, having to stand solely on his toes with his heels permanently raised, like the hind legs of a quadrupedal carnivore. He helped himself to balance by bracing one of his clawed hands against the wall. Once he was able to stand on 2 feet without falling over, Rambo noticed that, while standing, his forearms were long enough to nearly reach the floor. He tentatively took 1 step forward, then another, and stumbled upon the 3rd, bracing his fall with his hands. Rambo was surprised to find that his forearms held him steady. Their length made it so that he didn't have to work his core very hard, despite his knees not touching the ground. He was almost ashamed to admit that he felt more stable in this stance, hunched over on all 4s like a beast, than he did while trying to stand on his feet alone. Hesitantly, he raised a clawed hand before him and took a step forward, followed by another from his back leg. Then another. Then another. It wasn't long before he had walked the length of the room and back again, prowling in circles like a lion in a cage. At least the continuous movement took his mind off the lingering scent of iron. The speaker crackled to life. Up on your feet at last, I see. Itching for a hunt after recovering from your final software update before the beta test, are we? Rambo immediately halted himself in his tracks and turned his head to glare at the camera. A low, threatening rumble emanated from his throat. My, aren't you a scary one? The director taunted. Shut up. What is your grand plan, exactly? To sit here until you starve? Shut up. He sat on his haunches and glowered. You sure won't be of much use to your friends if you waste away here. Rather selfish of you, wouldn't you say? What? Rambo went silent as the lights on his mask flickered. Just like before, and the room that had been bathed in red and choked with wiring, the floodgates of Rambo's memory were open to him. He recalled the cabin, the warehouse, the abandoned mall. He remembered the faint sliver of sunlight that had been so tantalizingly close and yet so impossibly far from his reach. Faces of friends, old and new, flitted across his mind's eye. The mangled body of one lay only a few feet from an exit, pinned under the TV abomination's massive claws. The face of another, twisted in anguish, pointed the way towards a glowing button, a promise of salvation never delivered. A hand pressed a bloodied blade deeper into the palm that was still his, still human. That same hand stretching out to him from afar, both offering and begging for aid. But it was too late for the both of them. Or was it? Ah, that got your attention. Yes, your friends are indeed still with us, despite how you failed them in the past. They're a rather hardy lot, if I say so myself. Quite determined. They're alive? Rambo began to pace the room again as his mind filled with questions. Charlie's still alive? And Sneak too? What about the others? Are they here in this building? Did they change too? One of them was really quite feisty. What a fuss he made upon hearing that you would be repurposed. I think he was jealous. Perhaps he didn't want you stealing his limelight. I'd understand the sentiment. Even though you may not have the starring role this time around, you certainly are a showstopper, my boy. Who is he talking about? Whose limelight? Rambo began pacing more frantically as anxiety set in. But don't fret. They won't remember you. The show will play out as intended, and we will all have our curtain call, one way or another. What the hell does that mean? Does Showfall already do something to them? That is, if the curtain hasn't fallen for them already. It is up to the audience, after all. Rambo stopped pacing and stared at the camera again, his mind racing. What kind of metaphor is that? Has Hetch killed them, or worse? Is one of them going to end up in that box like I did? Has the audience already executed them? It's not like they haven't been through this song and dance before. Your friend in the hat sings particularly loudly every time he gets repurposed, but I think he's finally learned his lesson about what happens when you run off stage during a performance one too many times. Stop talking. Your glasses friend, though, he shows real promise. He's been around the block a few times, been cast in quite a number of supporting roles, that one, but his last performance had the audience raving. You should have seen the reviews. I don't care about the stupid reviews. I want to know where my friends are. You see, you, Rambo, offered the audience something valuable, someone to pity, to feel sad for, to empathize with. Your fate provided them with catharsis. But Charlie, he gave them something priceless, hope. And when that hope is stripped away, that's when the most beautiful bouquet of emotions begins to bloom. Either tell me where they are, or shut up. I'm tired of hearing your twisted poetry. The director continued to prattle on. The most evocative human emotion, Rambo, is pain. Not the physical kind, not at all. It is a wounded soul, reacting to twisted stimuli that becomes elevated into something truly beautiful. Fear of the end, terror over the thought of having what we know and love eventually wither and die as all things must, that is what makes life beautiful. Not love itself, not comfort, not happiness, but the prospect of losing it all. The words of Homer speak this very truth, and that is why they are timelessly remembered. Everything is more beautiful because we are doomed. For the love of God, shut up! Rambo had had enough. His mask flickered crimson, and with a speed and ferocity that surprised even himself, he leaped at the CCTV camera, tore it from the wall with his claws, and crushed it loudly between his mandibles. He spat out the obliterated camera with a clang, and kicked its remains across to the other side of the room. Hetch chuckled over the speaker, which apparently, to Rambo's disappointment, was not attached to the camera itself. If you want to sink your teeth into something so badly, something you no doubt claim to be an embodiment of evil itself, thus making you once more the hero, then so be it. I have a gift for you. You're sick. I don't want your gift, whatever it is. The door in the wall across from him opened once more with a mechanical hiss, and out stepped a singular showfall employee. A few paces into the room, they stopped, motionless, and the door closed behind them. Rambo stared. What is this? They were on the team that orchestrated your finale, Hetch proclaimed. It was they who held your head in place, securing it to our glorious machine. Rambo remembered the drones who had strung him up like a trophy against that crimson wall. He remembered the cold, hard surface of the Iron Maiden, and the rusted scent of dried blood that already coated its metal jaws. His hands twitched at the memory. It was they who held back your friend, stifling his voice before the camera. He remembered when the lights had dimmed in the heart of the facility, and he saw Charlie struggling in the grasp of two showfall drones, his hand reaching out in a fruitless effort to try and help him, despite how many times Rambo had let him down. They are the one who dragged him to the operating room, just like the one you're in now, kicking and screaming all the while. Anger began to flare in his soul, and the blood boiled in his veins. No, he didn't deserve this. None of them did. I may have failed the others, but it was you who put us into this waking nightmare to begin with. He began to move slowly, purposefully, towards the motionless figure. They were the one who cut the cord, who reset his mind, who rewired him, reprogrammed him, erased him. A low, mechanical growl rumbled in Rambo's throat. It was supposed to end with me. But you were never satiated by my blood alone, and you never will be. I know that now. He continued to move forward, unblinking, his eyes fixed upon the mask of that drone, on the image that had caused him and his friends so much unimaginable suffering, yet unaware that his own had begun to open. And you know what else? They've done this all before. And I've killed one of you before. He remembered the satisfaction he had felt upon plunging a dagger into the heart of one of the showfall drones back in the facility, upon feeling the blade sink deeper into the body, seeing the wires fall from the gaping wound like the viscera of a disemboweled animal. You're just a machine, inhuman, soulless. Again and again and again, and they will keep doing it. To you, to your friends, to countless others. And they will enjoy it. And so will I. Rambo's vision clouded with red as he drowned in his rage. He had no more room in his heart for grief or despair. For too long had Shofal been allowed to commit these atrocities. Too many people had suffered needlessly for the sake of nothing but sick entertainment for a nameless horde of onlookers. A searing anger burned in him, guiding his movements, eradicating reason. He unleashed a deafening cry, a bestial roar accompanied by a cacophony of machinery, and launched himself at the drone. He flew through the air with the speed of a bullet, and the drone did not react as they were knocked to the ground, their arms pinned onto the floor by claws of steel that pierced their flesh like spears. Rambo bellowed at them, spraying the mask that bore that hateful emblem with bloodied spittle, before he clenched his jaws directly into the symbol that had caused him so much pain. The plastic surface shattered under the sheer force of his bite, and when Rambo wrenched the mask away with his mandibles, the face of the drone came with it. The sound of grating metal and tearing flesh was not a harmony that was alien to him. Only now, the instrument and conductor had swapped places, an orchestra of entropy. The smell of freshly spilled blood, now soaking through his clothes, matting his hair, staining his limbs, was intoxicating. Blinded by bloodlust and primal famine, the Devourer sank its teeth into the stranger's neck and tore it asunder, spattering the wall behind with fresh crimson. Their limbs, still pinned under the beast's claws, convulsed for a second before falling still. The mauled chest cavity revealed a heart that still retained its warmth, but had given up trying to pump life through its bearer's veins. The abomination tore the vital organ from its victim's breast, crushed it in its jaws, and swallowed it whole. The room was dead silent, and the lights were dimmed. Blood continued to drain from what little was left of the mutilated body, still warm to the touch. The Devourer sat on its haunches in the center of the room like a hellhound, smothered in gore, its eyes hard and unreadable. Its hunger had been satiated, albeit temporarily. After a moment, the director's voice crackled from the speaker. It was different somehow, hollow, blunt, lacking its usual theatrical timbre, like he was breaking character for a moment. You must truly despise me, loathe me, want to force my own medicine down my throat until I choke. A brief pause lingered. I understand. Believe me, I've been choking on it for longer than you know. The Devourer remained motionless. After a moment, Hetch took a deep breath, and his voice became animated once more. You want to try your hand at playing the role of a savior with bloodied hands? Have at it, brute. Your coliseum of carnage lies before you. The doorway in the wall opened. A cold light bled into the room, and a rush of frigid air drained what little warmth was left. You wanted me to be your abomination, Shofall? To become your beast? So be it. Your lusus naturae is coming for you, Director, and it will not stop until you are crushed between the iron jaws of your own creation. The Devourer stepped out into the swirling snow, unfazed by the freezing temperature and howling winds. Before it left the blood-stained room for good, it heard the voice of the Director call out to it one last time. Go, Leonine Achilles. Hector awaits you on the battlefield. All the while, the mask flickered red, like a flame that refused to die.